Hello, fellow mech warriors, Mage Leader here. Now, this is going to be another one of my kind of unscripted rant type videos. I tried to script this one and make it into a fully produced thing, but honestly there's so much that I have to talk about here that I couldn't quite get my thoughts organized in a manner that made any real sense. And honestly, I find that I'm better at communicating this sort of thing when I'm just kind of shooting from the hip, so that's what I'm going to try to do today. I've kind of come here to make a follow-up to my previous Green Hornet video, which more people watched than I expected, so that was pretty cool of you guys, thank you for that. But I made a mistake in that video. I recommended a comic to you guys that I said was superior. I recommended the Green Hornet Year 1. Now when I recommended that, I had only read the first issue of it, and had not finished the rest of it yet. I had a little bit too much faith in Matt Wagner because of how much I enjoyed the Shadow Year 1, and I was like, well, he's in good hands. You know, the first issue is pretty good. You know, Matt Wagner's a good writer. I can safely recommend this. Since then, I've gone back and finished reading the Green Hornet Year 1, and I no longer recommend for you to read it. Long story short, this comic sucks. It really sucks. I'm glad that I mentioned in the video that I would cover it in more detail later on. Consider my recommendation from that video rescinded. This comic is bad, and I'm going to go into why. But there's a lot of issues here that don't just apply to this comic. They kind of apply to the entire Dynamite Green Hornet range, which isn't very extensive, first of all. Probably because it didn't sell super well. Like, can't imagine why. It's not like it's crap or anything. So that's more or less the topic for today. I'm going to be going and going and going and going and going on and on and on about this particular comic and the rest of the Dynamite range when it comes to the Green Hornet. And so, you know, let's just dive right in. So what is it about this comic in particular that chaps my ass? Well, you know, like I said, it's something that affects all of the Dynamite comics, but let's start off with the positive stuff. I think that the artwork in this comic overall, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but when it's showing the Green Hornet doing Green Hornet things, it's pretty cool. I think this is the best that the character has ever looked. I'm glad that they went with the 1940s film serial appearance. They kept a bunch of the aesthetics from that, and when he's in action, the artwork really shines through. Now people, when they're doing faces and whatnot, those look terrible. I mean, Britt Reed is absolutely hideous. What the fuck did they do to Casey? It's highly stylized. It's too much ink, really. Like way too much dark lines around the edges of things. It's overshadowed, and I get that they're trying to go for that sort of gritty noir type of look where everything is harshly lit and dark. The problem is that it applies too much to the characters' actual, you know, faces, so it gets to the point where, one, it's hard to tell characters apart from each other because they all just look like a fucking Rorschach test, and the ones that you do recognize look absolutely hideous. Again, just, oh my god, Casey, what did they do to you? So, you know, Casey's supposed to be the cute secretary character, and they made her look like she's a fucking 45-year-old hit-the-wall type of woman, which is not at all who she is. She's supposed to be, you know, more or less Britt Reed's love interest. I don't know what it is with Dynamite and hooking Britt Reed up with basically anyone else. He's supposed to end up with Casey. Fuck you. So that's just one issue. But when the Green Hornet is actually doing his typical work, it's good. Like, it looks cool when he's got the mask on, he's got the gun, and, you know, swinging around on rooftops and all that other stuff. The backdrops, I think, look very appealing. So that's a positive that this has going for it. I think that the opening of this comic is also pretty strong. There is definitely an issue with the pacing, and that's kind of shown from the word go. It's constantly hopping back and forth between flashbacks and present day, and I wouldn't mind so much, except it interrupts the present-day scenes. So the entire first issue is, present-day stuff, is covering basically the Green Hornet's first ever outing as the Green Hornet. It's a very simple affair where he sees some mob guys roughing up some Union guys in order to get the policies passed that they want, that would be the most beneficial to them. He shows up and basically breaks up the beatdown that they're trying to give the guy, and that very short. The scene itself would last maybe 2 minutes, if that, if you divorced it from the flashbacks. But every couple panels, they keep flashing back to the past, and it gets to the point where I'm like, why not just show the flashback as the first bit, and then come to this later when we've got all the build-up? This can be a payoff for it, rather than trying to run it alongside, because it doesn't have enough to it to warrant the interruptions. The interesting stuff is the backstory stuff. And, the Green Hornet has never really had a backstory in previous incarnations. It may have been hinted at a few times here and there. It's never really been fully explored, mostly because the Green Hornet doesn't really need an origin story. Everybody knows who he is and what he does. You don't need a detailed explanation of everything. We all just kind of assumed what his backstory was. But Matt Wagner, to his credit, does a decent job of making a believable origin story for him and Cato. He goes a long way to explaining why Cato has the abilities that he has. He also does a decent job of explaining Britt Reed's motivations. I always kind of assumed that he was motivated purely out of a drive to see justice done and to, ensure that the good guys win, which is still what he does. I didn't feel like it needed to be explained so explicitly, but he does show that there's a really good scene in particular. He starts out like this starry-eyed, the press will solve everything, it is the ultimate weapon of the people because we have the First Amendment and it allows us to say and speak truth to power and all this other stuff. And he goes to Africa and tries to establish a paper there, sort of as a way of letting the people fight back against the warlords and whatnot that have taken over this particular area that he's in. The problem comes when the local muscle decides that they don't like the paper that he set up, and they murder his friend that he's been working on the paper with and force him to go on the run. And he realizes, okay, so the press alone isn't enough. It's not enough to just be a good reporter and make sure that the truth is getting out to people. You need more than just that. You need actual people to step in and take action directly. So he's basically traveling the world trying to find himself, typical rich boy stuff. I feel like they make him a little bit too rich. Britt Reed has never been like a billionaire type. I think that's a bit much. He's not. I'd classify him as like upper middle class or lower upper class. I mean, he's rich, don't get me wrong, but he's not Bruce Wayne levels of rich. He's just kind of, his dad owns a newspaper, so he's got some money to play around with. He could probably afford a worldwide trip, and they do point out that he's kind of running low on funds when he comes back at the end of the flashback sequence. But it does feel like he's got a little bit too much money for the type of character that he is. But that's a very minor complaint, all things considered. And the general character writing for him at the very beginning is decent. It's a little ham-fisted, a little bit corny, a little bit over the top. I never get the impression that he's this super naive kid, but he's just starting out, so I guess you can get away with that sort of thing. Now, Cato's backstory is far superior. So, his thing is that he's been trained primarily by his father. His father is a samurai who is trying to keep the tradition alive, so he's taught Cato all the ancient ways and all the other things he needs to do, his typical Asian ex machina that he becomes famous for later on. Cato goes to university and studies engineering and science and mathematics and all this other stuff, which explains why he's going to be an inventor later on until they rob him of that for no reason. I'll get to that. But they explain all of that. He goes into the military during World War II and actually takes part in the massacre of Nanking, which is a very interesting turn. And that's kind of where he, I say kind of, it's where he becomes disillusioned with the idea of military life and the honorable service to your nation and your emperor, all that other type of thing. He sees what it brings about firsthand, and he has enough. So he turns himself into a ninja, essentially, running around and killing his former commanders as retribution for the terrible crimes that they've committed. And they allude to some seriously twisted stuff in these sequences. But overall, I think that it's done well, and it does a good job of explaining why he would have this sort of inclination toward becoming a vigilante alongside Britt Reed. So he meets up with Britt Reed, who has gotten stuck in Nanking during his worldwide travels. His vacation has been interrupted by the inconvenience of the Japanese invasion. So he's been following Cato around while hiding in Nanking. He's kind of been keeping track of what he's been doing, and eventually meets up with him. He's been captured by his former teammates, and they're going to execute him, and he rescues him. And, they hit it off and form a friendship and decide that they're going to escape China together. They run off and make it back to the U.S. When they get there, Britt Reed's father has passed away, and he takes over the newspaper, and he starts to uncover bits of corruption about, things that people having threatened the Sentinel and basically the local crime boss who runs the town. So, and they decide to take the law into their own hands, and it kind of goes on from there. And that whole first bit is pretty good. Like I said, the pacing is really wacky because it constantly cuts between their flashback sequences and the first night on the town. So you're taking a sequence of scenes that covers several years, decades, and you're sandwiching it between these bite-sized chunks that take a few seconds in the present day. And it gets to the point where it's really disorienting to bounce between, and you just wish that it would stick with one or the other, or give us this action scene as the final climax to the whole story, because it takes up the same amount of paper either way. Give us the action scene uninterrupted as the payoff for this whole thing. But they don't do that because they want to set up more of the Green Hornet, and the flashbacks continue through the entire comic, and it never gets any less disorienting as it goes along. He tries to be clever with it in a few places, where the Green Hornet will pull a new gadget out and start to use it, and then it will cut to a flashback of how he got it, which is okay most of the time, but it's still really jarring to swap between them like that. I'd rather they set these things up beforehand and then pay them off, rather than pay them off and be like, oh yeah, and here's the setup we forgot to do. So, it technically works, but, there was way better ways that you could do it. And, so the first bit of the comic is decently strong, and the backstory that they give to the Green Hornet is okay. But the rest of this comic is crap. I've been trying very hard to formulate my thoughts on just how annoying this comic is, and like I said, it covers the entire Dynamite range when it comes to the Green Hornet. I can't escape this sense that they just don't like the character very much, or at the very least, they're very apathetic to him. So, they got Kevin Smith to make a comic out of his rejected movie script. I say rejected. It was picked up, but the movie never actually went anywhere. So it's not like they read the script and were like, "Oh, this is crap. We're not going to make it." No, that was going to be the script for the movie for a while, until the rest of it fell through and they couldn't secure directors and funding and all this other stuff. And it saddens me to say this, but his work is probably the best Green Hornet that Dynamite has to offer you, at least the first 2 issues of his run. I mean, from there it goes downhill pretty quickly, but those first 2 issues cover that movie script, essentially. And then he tries to kind of continue on with it with the characters he created for that particular script. And, it all falls apart from there because it's Kevin Smith. What are you going to do? But, yeah, sad to say, that's about as good as it gets when it comes to Dynamite Green Hornet. I had high hopes for Green Hornet Year 1 because I read The Shadow Year 1 and really liked it. And I was like, okay, so Matt Wagner can handle these sort of classic characters decently well. He should be able to do the Green Hornet. But I get a sense that he doesn't like the Green Hornet reading this. There's a lot of correction, for lack of a better term, that he does, where he looks at things that the Green Hornet has done in the past, and then it comes across like he's saying, yeah, well, that's dumb, and I don't like how they did that, and that doesn't make sense to me, so I'm going to do it this way because it's better. Case in point, I'd say, is the Hornet gun. The Hornet gun, for those who don't know, is the Green Hornet's primary weapon, and its depiction varies from place to place, but for the most part, it is portrayed as a pistol that has been modified to shoot gas pellets. And yes, it is a Mauser C96. Fuck you, Razor. I heard what you said about it. No, it is a C96, or it's supposed to be, that Cato has modified with compressed gas cylinders in order to silently propel a projectile loaded with knockout gas. He's basically turned it into an early paintball gun. And this is one of the things that frustrates me with this comic in particular. Even Seth Rogen got this part right, with how the Hornet gun is supposed to work. Granted, his Hornet gun looked absolutely moronic, but even he realized that it was a pellet gun that shoots gas-loaded pellets that disperses almost immediately after impact and delivers a concentrated dose to the person that it hits. Does it make perfect sense, physically speaking? If we take all the math into the equation, does it make perfect sense? No. It's a gadget. It's a superhero gadget, and it works because it works. But Matt Wagner is concerned that using it would fill up a room with gas and would knock out the Green Hornet as well. So rather than just be like, well, this is the Green Hornet's weapon and he's going to use it because that's his thing, he changes it and quote-unquote improves it. And the thing I wouldn't mind so much, except that the thing he comes up with is even dumber. So what he does is he makes it an electric weapon, of all things, and uses the gas as a transmission medium to direct the electrical current toward a target, which doesn't make any more sense than the concentrated pellet to the face that the Green Hornet was already using. In fact, I think it makes less sense than that does. And on top of that, now he's given him a weapon that's way more powerful. Rather than being something you have to shoot each bad guy with individually, which kind of evened the playing field, now it's a weapon that can take out a whole room of bad guys with a single trigger pull, which is way too powerful for the Green Hornet to be carting around. And it takes out a lot of the fun of how he works. So now, almost every fight with him is trivialized. He can go in super outnumbered into this huge group of bad guys and just gas everybody. Where before, he'd have to at least try to sneak in, Because that's the thing with the Green Hornet. He's not a one-man army. He's not some sort of powerhouse. He's not he doesn't have any superpowers. He's just a regular guy with a gun that shoots gas pellets. And he goes in and uses his brains to overcome his opponents rather than his muscle. And he uses his muscle too, typically when things are going south, and usually just to keep himself alive, more so than, beat up everybody in a room and then threaten the bad guy with how intimidating you are. I mean, he does that too sometimes, but for the most part, he doesn't have to resort to physical violence to get his way, because he's just... He leverages people with information that he has. That's how he should be working. The truly powerful have no need for that sort of physical violence. And, he'll do it. He'll do it just as much as any other superhero, but it's not his default approach to things. So now you've given him this super powerful weapon, so now what's he gonna do? Well, every time he shows up at a bad guy lair, he kicks in the front door and just lays down everybody who's in that particular space beats his way through, and then comes up to the bad guy and is like, all right, here I am, all your goons are gone, I'm in charge now. And it takes out a lot of the charm of the character when he's just another muscle man. He comes across as a lot darker and grittier and just generally not the Green Hornet. But that's just one issue among many of where Matt Wagner has taken how the character has worked before and acted like, well, that's dumb, so I'm going to do it my way. He does that with their hideout, which brings, it makes me think that he's never actually listened to the radio show or watched the film serials. I think he watched like a couple episodes of the 60s show, if that. Or I think what he really did was he looked up, on Wikipedia who the Green Hornet was and how he worked, and then just came up with his own idea after seeing some pictures on Google Images. Because he feels the need to move the Green Hornet's base of operations away from his house, where he was running it before, and into like an abandoned warehouse, because it will be less suspicious. I don't see the logic behind that. I mean, Batman's Batcave has been underneath Wayne Manor, and nobody's felt the need to change that. Not really, because the whole logic is like, well, people will see your car coming back. Well, the whole idea behind the car is that nobody can catch it or see where it's going. That's the whole idea behind it. The Black Beauty, at least from what I can tell, seems to be in many ways the inspiration for the Batmobile, and so there's no need to be like, well, we have to move it to a different location because coming back to the alleyway behind your house is dumb. And I'm Matt Wagner, and I'm smarter, so I'm gonna fix this problem with the Green Hornet. A problem that was never a problem to begin with. And, there's just a bunch of that throughout this entire origin and explanation, where it's like, well, the Green Hornet would normally do it this way, but some character's going to say, well, that's dumb, and then you're gonna present a quote-unquote better way for the character to do things. And it just shows that I don't think Matt Wagner likes the Green Hornet very much. Which is a real shame, because, again, he did good work on the Shadow, and you can tell that he likes the Shadow, or at the very least, he did his research with the Shadow, most of the time. But that same sort of respect doesn't really apply to this comic with the Green Hornet. So he takes away the stuff that makes the Hornet interesting on the, under the guise of fixing it and improving it, and in reality just makes him into another caped crusader, which isn't what the Green Hornet is. They also insert something into his character that carries across the entirety of the Dynamite range. And I watched Razor Fist's Shadowcast episode where he talks about the Dark Knight's crossover with the Shadow, which sounds like a really cool idea and concept. Have him work alongside the Shadow. I mean, it doesn't work if you actually examine the Green Hornet's character, but it's a neat idea. But the problem is that there and in this comic as well, there's this ridiculous assumption that the Green Hornet has some sort of I never kill policy. A lot like Batman's somewhat silly moral crusade. So that's not how the Green Hornet works. But they try to say that, well, I never kill because it's wrong to kill, or thou shalt not kill, or I was raised to think that killing was bad. Bitch, the Green Hornet has killed so many bad guys throughout his run. Both in comics, he's done it in the film serials, he's done it in the 60s TV show, he did it in the radio show. The Green Hornet is perfectly capable of taking a life. There is no reason to assume that he has this sort of aversion to killing. He does use a non-lethal gun, but that's mostly because he believes in due process. He wants to try to bring guys in to face trial. It's one of the things that could be brought up in a crossover with the Shadow, where the Shadow is dishing out his own brand of justice because he believes that the law can be corrupted. And that brings in another part of the Green Hornet story that Dynamite doesn't seem to understand, and that is District Attorney Scanlon. The Green Hornet's already an underrated character, but an underrated character within his story is D.A. Scanlon. Scanlon is one of the only people who knows the Green Hornet's identity, who knows that the Green Hornet is a good guy. I'll circle back to that. But he is essentially fantastical version of the incorruptible legal figure. He's a lawyer, he's a public official, but he's a good one, and he's got this sort of mission where he's going after the corruption in the city, and he works alongside the Green Hornet. He's a vigilante in his own right, just kind of doing it in his own way. The Green Hornet has this luxury that a lot of other heroes don't have, where he has the assurance that if he brings in a crook with evidence, he can reliably count on a conviction and a fitting punishment for said conviction. He is able to secure justice through the legal system in his city because of D.A. Scanlon. And really, that's the reason for his non-lethal approach. He believes that they have the right to that due process, and at least in his area, it's set up in a way so that that sort of thing, that the law and justice are one and the same. So when he debates with the Shadow in Dark Knights about whether or not justice or the law are the same thing, it kind of comes across as silly, because the Green Hornet would know, working in other areas, that the law can be corrupted, and he wouldn't be opposed to killing somebody in another area. He does it, like in his adventures where he goes to other places, where it's not clear that somebody will meet with justice if they get arrested, then he can take matters into his own hands. This idea that he's afraid to get his hands dirty because he's afraid that will make him no better than the bad guys he's fighting. I mean, he tries to come across as one of the bad guys that he's fighting. It's how he works. It's just the silliest idea to be like, oh, I never kill, or I'm opposed to it, and you do that, and you're bad because you do that. I feel like that would be an area where he and the Shadow would butt heads, but only if they were working in Britt Reed's actual city, where somebody can get a fair trial and will face justice if they get arrested. In his particular area, that is the case. I think that's the only time where you would see that sort of ideological difference come about. And that goes for the entire range, and it permeates this comic in particular super deep, and it comes across as really ham-fisted, very cheesy. It's not delivered well. Britt Reed doesn't really have a reason for his non-lethal approach other than just, I think it's bad. Cato, I understand. Having been at Nanking, he's disillusioned with the idea of violence as a whole and seeks for non-lethal approaches to everything that he does because he's scarred by the war. That I can understand. Britt Reed, I don't get it with him. Like, there's no reason for him to be like that. But that's far from the only issue with how they handle Britt Reed's character. There's also the issue where they don't really bring out the parts that make him interesting or fun to read about or listen to or watch. The thing is with the Green Hornet is that he is an incredibly skilled detective. He's able to, with his information from his newspaper, with his, reporter's intuition and his knowledge of how the underworld works, he's able to take scattered pieces of evidence from around the city and kind of just compile them in his head and figure out what it is that the bad guys are up to, and not only that, figure out a plan of action for taking them down. He's always thinking several steps ahead of the bad guys, and that kind of comes across in here sometimes, but it feels a lot more like he's stumbling across his solutions rather than coming up with them himself or just getting them from someone else. And the funny thing is, this is an aspect of the character that Kevin Smith got right, which I am shocked is the case. But Kevin Smith's Green Hornet, which follows Britt Reed Jr., has more Green Hornet in it than this entire comic, because he's actually working the way the Green Hornet would. They also handle his approach and personality very poorly. This comic came out in 2010, which meant that Iron Man was out, and the Avengers was coming, and it was the thing at the time to have quippy, smart-ass superheroes. I mean, it still is. But for some reason, the Green Hornet is quipping his way through virtually every scene. It gives the impression that he's not taking it seriously, which is not how the Green Hornet has ever worked. He takes it very seriously. It's his job. He's not the type to crack jokes in the middle of things. So it causes these massive problems in tone, but also just feels really out of character. If you watch anything with the Green Hornet in it, he shows up in a scene and commands respect by the virtue of his sheer presence. Just his being in the room is enough to be intimidating, and he knows it. So rather than, being a smartass and taunting his opponents, what he does instead is he states in simple English, in a soft tone of voice or a commanding tone of voice, but never really raising it, what his intentions are, what's going to happen, what he's going to do. He lays down the law whenever he comes into a given space. He has no need for threats, he has no need for any sort of intimidation or taunting, and he certainly doesn't have any predisposition to making light of the situation that they're in. He takes his work very seriously, and it's part of that bit of his persona that makes him fun to watch. He doesn't work as well when he's quipping up a storm. It kind of ruins the vibe of the whole thing. So then, beyond all of that, there's an issue that I think really carries across, specifically across the entire Dynamite range, and I feel like it's what, at least for me, really hampers his crossover attempts with the Shadow. And that is that they don't want to make the Green Hornet the Green Hornet, they want to make him a more generic superhero type of character, I think out of an attempt for more mass appeal. And so when he comes across other more interesting heroes like the Shadow, they just kind of have him sit in the back and play second fiddle, not really bringing any of his unique skills to the table. So what you're left with is the Shadow dominates the story that they're in together, and outside of maybe a couple brief discussions with the Green Hornet, they don't really have any substantial enough differences for them to not work together. It's something that's very silly. The whole concept of the Green Hornet and the Shadow working side by side is already pretty laughable, and typically the writers have to bend over backwards to make it even remotely feasible. So, why is that? Well, the Green Hornet isn't a crime fighter like most people think of. He fights crime, don't get me wrong, but the difference is that nobody knows that's what he's doing. He's specifically keeping that a secret and portraying himself as a mobster like the rest of them. So he walks in and he tries to strike up a deal with the other mob bosses in his area. He has an offer for them, he has a skill set to offer them, he wants a cut of what they're after, and then uses that position on the inside to gather information and proof and evidence in order to give it to Scanlon, have them brought down. That's kind of his typical MO. I mean, there's a lot that shakes it up from there, or other times he just kind of infiltrates and picks it apart from the inside out, and he always makes it look like he's eliminating his competition, more so than he's on some sort of, justice spree. So there's no reason for anyone outside of his little circle to assume that he's a good guy. If anything, if the Green Hornet met the Shadow would probably be trying to take him out, and it would be a horror survival story as he comes up against this super powerful, super capable, almost force of nature that is constantly hunting him down. And then it could be interesting where he has to actually try and figure out a way to get the Shadow to stop hunting him without giving away everything about him or revealing to the world who he is. That would be a really interesting story, and that's the approach that I'm taking with the one that I'm working on now. But there's no reason whatsoever for the Green Hornet and the Shadow to work together, because as far as anyone knows, the Green Hornet is just another mobster. So, again, the Shadow would be trying to take him out. So already, right from the inception, they've got this issue where they've got a premise that just doesn't pass muster if the Green Hornet is in character. So he starts off the story out of character, and it just gets worse from there, and ultimately, you're left with a very boring version of the Green Hornet, and I shudder to think of people who maybe this is their only introduction to the Green Hornet. I think that that's a damn shame, because there's just none of what is cool about the Green Hornet in these comics, and I also feel really bad about having recommended Green Hornet Year 1, because again, it is just without anything that makes it interesting. The villain that he's up against isn't interesting. One of the ways that the Green Hornet radio show in particular, but also the film serials and TV show. One of the ways that they make the stories more interesting was by having the villain be interesting. The Green Hornet himself is just kind of... he's a force for good. So his approach is dictated not so much by his own quirkiness, but it's more in response to what the bad guy is doing. So, and that's kind of... that's how they make the stories, more unique. So, for example, in one of the radio show episodes, there's one where the guy is using... he's pretending to be a psychic medium and using kind of smoke and mirrors parlor tricks to convince widows that they're talking to their dead husbands, and then the husband gives them advice to invest their money with this particular investment firm who's actually scamming them out of their money. And that's interesting, and the Green Hornet works by basically infiltrating their system and taking out the guy who's doing the voice and the parlor trick, and what he does is he sabotages one of these psychic sessions and makes it look like the guy who's running these little psychic scams is trying to double-cross the guy who runs the insurance firm that he's working with by recommending that the widows invest with a different firm. And so it ends up with the two bad guys going after each other. So they end up taking each other out. And that's what makes it more interesting than just, oh, well, there's a mobster, and I went and found out he's doing a thing here, so I went and punched everybody until they were unconscious. Then I went over here to this other thing that he's running, and I punched everyone until they were unconscious. And then I went over here to where this guy's other little thing is going, and I punched everyone until they were unconscious. And then I finally got to the big bad guy himself, and I punched him until he was unconscious. That's what this particular comic has. And it is so much less interesting and so much less fun than what the Green Hornet typically does. So, it's a very boring Green Hornet story on top of having the Green Hornet be a more boring character. Ultimately, what you're left with is something that, while it has some good art and some good ideas, it's actively trying to sabotage the Green Hornet's approach to things by being like, oh, well, my approach is better. It's got him out of character, not acting like himself, and it's got him going after a mystery and a bad guy who is probably the most boring and generic out of all the bad guys he's ever faced. There's just nothing to this comic. It's not fun, it's not good, and it's a problem that really carries across to all of Dynamite's Green Hornet comics. So at the end of the day, that's kind of got to be my takeaway from it. It doesn't feel like Dynamite really knows what the Green Hornet is or what to do with him, because when they bring him out, they just want him to be another capeshit, boring superhero type who doesn't have any of the stuff that makes him unique and fun. I rescind my recommendation for Green Hornet Year 1. Give it a hard pass. If you have to read the Green Hornet in comics, you can pick a spot from most anywhere in his timeline, and you'll get, while not Shakespeare, you'll get at the very least a somewhat faithful adaptation of what the TV show was like, or what the film serials were like, or the radio show. You'll get a more consistent version of his character, and while the story itself might not be spectacular, you'll at least have a better idea of what the Green Hornet is. If you're still interested in the Green Hornet, and I sincerely hope that I haven't scared you off by talking about this bad comic, I would recommend starting not here, but with an episode of the radio show. The 1960s TV series is also a decent place to start. The whole thing is on YouTube, and you can find it. But specifically, on the website that I have linked in the description, I would choose episode 4, which is called There Was a Crooked Man. It's a story that I actually used an audio clip of in my last video, and it gives you a good idea of what the Green Hornet is, what he does, how he works, and while also being a fun story, it's not one of the most out there of his stories. It's fairly basic, but it involves an attempt to strong-arm a public official, and it shows how Britt Reed finds out about it, and how the Green Hornet responds to it, how everything goes down. It is one of the better episodes of the radio show, in my opinion, and I think that is probably the best introduction point to the Green Hornet that you can get. So there's that, there's the 60s TV show, there's the film serials. If you're looking to start, 25 minutes of audio, There Was a Crooked Man, give it a listen, and you will have a much better introduction to the character than anything Dynamite has ever put out. In all, my recommendation at the end of the day is avoid the Dynamite range of Green Hornet comics. I feel bad for having recommended it before. Again, that was mostly due to me having a little too much faith in Matt Wagner based off of his previous work. It's very clear that he doesn't like the Green Hornet, so he's made what's essentially just a crappy Green Hornet story here. Your real entry point, in my opinion, should be the radio show. So that's really all that I have to say on the topic at hand. I've gone through more or less my thoughts on the Green Hornet Year 1. I would recommend that you steer clear of it and go straight for the radio show. Episode 4, There Was a Crooked Man. Give it a listen. I think that you'll actually really like it. If you have any sort of appreciation for audio drama or for pulp-style characters, it is probably one of the better examples that I could just pull off the top of my head. And there's tons of great episodes of the radio show that you can listen to from there. It's almost to the extent where you can just kind of point your finger at one and be like, yep, that's a good one. It's fairly consistent quality all the way through. So again, I've got the links down in the description. Go and give it a listen. It won't take up too much of your time, and I think that it will sell you on the concept of the Green Hornet, but avoid the comics. So that's all that I have to say, and until next time, this is Mage Leader, signing off.